So let's frame the morning. It's the last day of the summer. The new reports yesterday, of course, pressure mounting all around the president. People shocked at just how much pressure this president is under. The Russia probe, the midterm elections, his legal team in limbo, and now after hastening the exit of his top White House lawyer in a tweet, there is new reporting that Donald Trump is shockingly, woefully ill-prepared for the constitutional crisis that is now engulfing his presidency. It is a crisis that could very well lead him down the path to impeachment. Many say it absolutely will. And despite all that, or perhaps because of all that, he's picking fights every day, new ones, often on Twitter, often with zero facts. Ludicrous. American companies, departments of government, the post office, a U.S. war hero. And now these institutions, these elected officials, these foreign allies are forced to fact-check the leader of the free world. This is where we are at. President Trump accuses Google of repressing him. Google says it's not true. He accuses South Africa of all but condoning violence against white farmers. South Africa says he's misinformed. He says trade is costing American jobs. A Republican senator says simply wrong. He says the Attorney General never took control of the Justice Department. Jeff Sessions says he did from day one. Can this distraction campaign be new for White House insiders? Whoever is left? Donald Trump seems to be woefully ill-equipped for the looming constitutional crisis that could end his presidency. And of course, none of his staff, whoever is left, seem to have the guts to tell him. Willie, the Washington Post, Ashley Parker has a strong piece this morning that gets into this portrait of a president flailing at straw men. Take us through it.
Yeah, and all this is the split screen as America says goodbye to American hero and Senator John McCain, who will lie in state today at the Capitol Rotunda. As you mentioned, the front page story in the Washington Post depicts the president divorcing himself and his supporters from reality. Ashley Parker writes, over roughly the past day, President Trump has decried the totally dishonest media with its fake news and fake books, as he says. He's argued Google is biased against conservatives. He has accused NBC News of fudging the tape of an interview with him that has been available online for more than a year. The president even has declared there is no chaos in his White House, which he claimed is a smooth-running machine with changing parts, despite the tumult that emanates almost daily from within its walls. Trump's assertions, all on Twitter, some false, some without clear evidence, come just over 9 weeks before the midterm elections that could help to determine his fate. And they're bound by one unifying theme. All of his perceived opponents are peddling false facts, and only Trump can be trusted. The frenzied pace of Trump's tweeting, specifically his warning against fake books, is viewed by some as a reaction to Bob Woodward's upcoming release, Fear Trump in the White House. And last night in Indiana, the president's mind preoccupied by coverage of his West Virginia rally 10 days ago.
Last week, you saw it, I was in the great state of West Virginia. We were in a fantastic arena, beautiful, smaller than this, but a very great place. We had crowds that were incredible. A writer for the New York Times that pretends she knows what she's talking about hasn't got a clue. Now, and I'm telling you, the enthusiasm was the same. The place was packed. She made the statement that President Trump was disappointed to see some empty chairs. Yeah, they were going to the bathroom, maybe.
So, Jonathan Lemire, you and I were joking before I came on the air that I've been away on an 11-day road trip down the West Coast, took Twitter off my phone. Not a whole lot has changed, just a different time and a different venue for the president, going after his perceived enemies, the slights against him, and all this, again, as I say, as the nation's paying tribute to a man that he holds in disdain, frankly, John McCain.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Yes, we saw this last night, that the president made no mention of John McCain. You know, as much of the nation is focused on paying tribute to a war hero, a decorated senator, someone who gave his whole life mostly for his country, Donald Trump has perpetuated a torrent of grievances against him. you may have missed, there was an issue with the flag at the White House.
I saw, yes.
And that it was not at half-staff, unlike the rest of the nation's government. It was for just a day, and then it was raised again, and only after an uproar was it then put back to where it appropriately should be. I think what you saw last night is very illustrative of where the president's mindset is. He cannot let any perceived slight go. That West Virginia rally 10 days before, yes, it was a pretty good crowd. My colleague in the room reported, though, however, there were empty seats. It didn't quite have the usual sort of enthusiasm that a Trump rally usually does. Certainly last night in Indiana did. That crowd ate up everything he had to say, and it was sort of a greatest hits of the Trump experience, including his attacks at the media, at institutions, at the FBI, the Department of Justice. And that, I think, for many people, was the takeaway from last night, was him once again suggesting that he may need to intervene with the ongoing Russia probe, with the workings of the Department of Justice, because he feels like it's biased against him.
And as you write in a piece that we'll talk about in a minute, some people within the White House, former officials in the White House, worry that this White House is not prepared for what's coming down the road. Nika?
Well, Susan Del Percio, I want to get your take on this. It's a big one. We're seeing significant institutions and people pushing back at some of these unsubstantiated claims by the president. I mentioned a few of those at the top, and they're hard to believe, but let's go through some more. Donald Trump says in a tweet, seemingly based on a Fox News segment, that China hacked Hillary Clinton's private email server. An FBI official tells NBC News that the Bureau has not found any evidence that Clinton's servers were compromised. Trump accuses Google of not promoting his State of the Union address like they did when President Obama was in office. Google fired back in a statement given to BuzzFeed, saying they did promote Trump's 2017 State of the Union, but not his first address to Congress, something they also did not do for Obama in 2009. The president initially would not budge in keeping the flag at the White House at half-staff in honor of John McCain. He only reportedly gave in after a stern public statement from the American Legion. Last week, Trump tweeted about having the State Department look into the large-scale killing and seizure of land from white farmers. It was another tweet inspired by a Fox News segment. The South African government responded, saying Trump was wrong. Trump tweeted the other day that we lose jobs and over $800 billion a year on really dumb trade deals, and these same countries tariff us to death. Republican Senator Ben Sasse responded, quote, "This is simply wrong." And last week, after the president said that Attorney General Jeff Sessions never took control of the Justice Department, and it's a sort of incredible thing, Sessions issues a rare public response to the president, which read in part, "I took control of the Department of Justice the day I was sworn in. While I am Attorney General, the actions of the Department of Justice will not be improperly influenced by political considerations." Wow. Susan, I ask you, is it good news that we're seeing this pushback? Or bad news that, and this is where I would probably weigh in, that it has to happen in the first place?
Well, it is good news that there is pushback, and I think we'll see a lot more of it. But to your point as being bad news in the first place that it has to happen, I think this week was particularly unraveling for Donald Trump, starting on Sunday morning when he started to see the coverage on Fox about the passing of Senator John McCain. And we just saw him spin out after that, the tributes to John. And you know, we know that the president projects. So we saw a lot of the lack of President Trump's, we saw his deferments compared to Senator McCain's service. I think it was just, Donald Trump knew in that moment he would never receive those accolades from the American public, from the military, from everybody in a bipartisan way, and he will never go down as being 1/10 of 1% of what John McCain was and how he served his country. And I think that just made these things just roll out and have him just frankly go, you know, completely unhinged.
You know, Gene Robinson, even by the Trump standard, it still is jarring to see a president of the United States not able to overcome his own gripes with John McCain over the years. Going back to, if we want to go back even further than, but in the campaign when he talked about John McCain not being a war hero, even in death, to not be able to get over your petty grievances with John McCain, it's actually sad to watch.
Yeah, it is sad and it is weird. You have to, with Trump, it's always part calculation, part crazy, right? And you have to take into account both his calculation and his craziness. Now, he likes to dominate every news cycle. He wakes up every morning, I think, determined to win that day, that episode of this really weird and tiresome reality show that he's running. And so all of this, that's a partial kind of rational, I guess, motive, but it overlaid is his all his neuroses, all his insecurities about himself, about his performance, about his his deferments that he got because of his bone spurs, and whether that makes him less of a man, about his small hands, probably, whatever, and so you see that too. So you can't tease apart the calculation from the crazy. It all just adds into it's really an extraordinary week. If you just step back and just look at what we have heard from this president just over the past week, you would never believe that you would hear such things from the head of state of the most obscure banana republic, let alone the president of the United States.
Gene, you're so right. You just wouldn't expect it. Jonathan Lemire, let's talk about your reporting. Bring it to the table. You say Trump allies are fretting over the West Wing vacancies as threats loom. Talk about those threats.
Yeah, there are a few things going on, Mika. Certainly Don McGahn's, the White House counsel's imminent departure, which was announced earlier this week, with some dispute over whether he's resigning or the president is firing him, and whether or not he had anything to do with the president not firing Bob Mueller to this point, is sort of emblematic of what's going on in this White House. They have struggled from the beginning to recruit top-flight talent into the building, and we have seen a steady stream of departures with very few big names replacing them. And the legal team in particular has had some, shall we say, challenges. Rudy Giuliani is far more of a public spokesman, a TV personality, than he is a lawyer. Certainly in the building, Emmett Flood is someone who people around the president do have respect for. They think he is a top-flight lawyer, but there is very little with him, and there's a lot coming. Not only is it going to be whatever Mueller brings to the table when he issues his report, if the Democrats flip the House this fall, which of course a lot of people, including Trump allies, expect and fear, not only are you going to have impeachment talk, but according to our reporting, there are a lot of people around the White House who are terrified that even if the Democrats stay away from impeachment, it is just going to be, they're going to control the committees, and it's going to be investigation after investigation after investigation, where they're going to haul people up from the Trump world to testify about not just Russia, but about corruption, about emoluments, about just the day-to-day workings of this government. That basically anyone who's ever said the name Donald J. Trump is probably going to have to take an oath in front of Congress. And there are a lot of people around the president who are very anxious, that they're saying they're ill-prepared for what's coming.
So, Casey, the Senate Majority Leader, the Speaker of the House, the Vice President of the United States, all will speak today at a ceremony to honor President John McCain. What are they thinking as they watch this week unfold, as they watch the president lash out against his enemies, his perceived enemies, those who have come against him? John McCain is so revered, as you know better than I, in the halls of that Senate. What are they thinking as they watch the president's treatment of this week?
You know, Willie, I've been thinking back on this because I actually was in Arizona for most of this week. And as you've sat here and recited what has been going on in Washington in the times that I was gone, I realized that I was much more caught up, and the people that I was talking to on the ground in Arizona were much more caught up in what was going on with Senator McCain. And my sense is that's a reflection of a broader mood in the country over the course of the past week, and helps explain the president's behavior. I mean, how many times has he been knocked out of the headlines, and in this incredibly, powerful and graceful end to an incredible American life, John McCain has kind of taken the country's narrative for himself, planning his own funeral. We're still going to see, we haven't heard the eulogies from President Obama and President Bush that he planned for himself. We haven't yet seen these tributes from his Republican colleagues. The reality is, not everybody in Washington liked John McCain. Certainly, even people who loved him didn't like him every day. That was the kind of guy that he was. But at the end of the day, day. He represented something that was great about this country, and I think everyone has been so focused on honoring that. And I think it feels as well like a little bit of a relief to be able to remember that, you know, this is what makes America great. It's people like John McCain. And I think that is very much the sentiment that you're going to see on display at the Capitol today.
Well, and his greatness and his looming legacy, John McCain in death is showing just how small Donald Trump is in life. Still, and we'll have much more on John McCain coming up. Still ahead on Morning Joe, the president's former national security advisor is speaking out. Not the one who's guilty of lying to the FBI, but the one who was fired for not marching lockstep with the president's positions. What H.R. McMaster is now saying about Donald Trump's summit with Vladimir Putin.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.